The night was still, save for the occasional rustle of leaves stirred by a cold breeze. Thomas, the grave digger, swung his shovel into the damp earth under the pale glow of the cemetery's only functioning lantern. He was used to this kind of work, monotonous, silent, and solitary. But tonight, something felt off. The coffin was unmarked, its surface unusually pristine compared to the weathered ones he normally dealt with. No nameplate, no dates. Just a simple, dark wood box with iron clasps. When Thomas opened it, expecting the usual remains, his heart skipped a beat. Inside was no body, only a leather-bound journal, its cover worn and cracked with age. Curiosity overpowered caution as he picked it up. It felt heavier than it should, almost as if it resisted being lifted. The clasp holding it shut unlatched on its own with a faint click. Thomas hesitated, glancing around. The cemetery loomed eerily silent, the shadows of headstones stretching like skeletal fingers. Flipping open the first page, he saw no title, no name. Only a date, today's date. Beneath it, in a spidery hand, the entry read, 10:15 p.m. Thomas adjusts the lantern before wiping sweat from his brow. He hesitates briefly as if sensing he is being watched. He continues digging, uncovering the journal just as the hour strikes 10:30. Thomas froze. His breath hitched as he glanced at his watch. 10:30 p.m. It was exact. His hands trembled, but he couldn't stop reading. He opens the journal, compelled by a mixture of dread and curiosity. As the wind whispers through the graves, a shadow flits between the headstones. It watches him, waiting. Thomas's blood turned cold. He snapped his head up, his eyes darting around the cemetery. In the periphery of the flickering lantern light, he thought he saw movement, a fleeting shape slipping behind a headstone. "Who's there?" he called, his voice cracking. The silence that followed was heavier than the night itself. And then, the next entry began to write itself before his eyes, the ink flowing across the page as if guided by an unseen hand. 10:35 p.m. Thomas hears a whisper in the distance, soft but insistent, "Leave." He chooses to stay, and so it comes closer. A chill ran down his spine as he heard it, a faint, raspy whisper carried on the wind, "Leave." Thomas slammed the journal shut. His instinct screamed to run, but his legs felt like they were sinking into the very ground he dug. The whispers grew louder, circling him like a predator stalking its prey. It was then he realized the cemetery had fallen unnaturally still. No rustling leaves. No chirping crickets. Only the growing cadence of whispers, each one closer than the last. Thomas clutched the journal against his chest, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He stumbled back from the open grave, the whispers now coalescing into a singular, distorted voice. "Leave, Thomas." The voice was guttural, unnatural, as if it came from beneath the ground. Thomas's breath came in ragged gasps as he forced himself to look around the cemetery. The shadows that danced on the edges of the lantern's light seemed alive, writhing like they had minds of their own. His instinct screamed to run, but the journal tugged at him like a chain, pulling his eyes back to its aged pages. He flipped it open, his hands trembling so violently he almost dropped it. The next entry read, 10:40 p.m. Thomas peers into the shadows, his fear choking him. He thinks of leaving, but the journal won't let him. It holds him fast, demanding his attention as the presence draws closer. Thomas swallowed hard, his gaze darting back to the shifting shadows. One of them moved differently from the rest, a tall, spindly figure just beyond the reach of the light. It leaned unnaturally, its limbs elongated and jagged like broken branches. It was watching him. He tried to step back, but his legs felt like lead. "What do you want?" he shouted into the suffocating night. His voice cracked, barely audible over the whispering wind. The journal's pages began to flutter on their own, stopping on a fresh entry written in that same spidery hand. It does not speak to him, for it does not need to. It only waits. Waits for him to make the wrong choice. Thomas's knees buckled, and he sank to the ground. The journal's text seemed to shimmer in the lantern light, almost mocking him. His fingers hovered over the page, desperate to close it, to throw it back into the coffin and forget this nightmare. But as he tried, the journal refused to shut. The pages seemed glued open, forcing him to stare at the next passage. 10:45 p.m. Thomas decides to leave the journal behind. But when he does, the ground beneath him stirs, and the soil opens like a hungry maw. His blood turned to ice. No, 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 he muttered, shaking his head. This isn't real. The shadowy figure stepped closer, its body shifting unnaturally with every movement. It didn't walk so much as glide, its elongated arms dragging the air around it like smoke. The whispers intensified, the voice now guttural and relentless. Stay, and no, or run, and die. Thomas gripped the journal tighter, his knuckles white. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to flee, to get as far from this cursed cemetery as possible. But the journal seemed to pulsate in his hands, its weight anchoring him to the spot. The figure stopped at the edge of the light, just close enough for him to make out its face or the void where a face should have been. Instead, there was only darkness, swirling like a vortex. It raised a crooked hand and pointed at him. The journal wrote itself again, the ink bleeding into the page as if the words were alive. 10:50 p.m. Thomas makes his choice, and with it, seals his fate. The thing that lurks has waited centuries for this moment. And now, it will have him. Thomas looked up, his voice barely above a whisper. What do you want me to do? The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised both its arms, and the earth beneath him began to quake. The open grave yawned wider, and he felt himself sliding toward its edge, the soil shifting like quicksand. Stop, he screamed. I'll stay. I'll dash. But his words were swallowed by the ground as the journal's text morphed again. He has chosen to stay, but it is never that simple. And then the lantern flickered, its light fading, leaving him in suffocating darkness. Thomas clawed at the shifting soil, his fingers digging into the loose earth as the grave yawned wider beneath him. His screams echoed uselessly in the dark cemetery. The figure at the edge of the lantern's light tilted its head unnaturally, as if savoring his struggle. The journal, now impossibly heavy, clung to his hands like an anchor, pulling him closer to the grave's hungry mouth. Don't fight, fate! The voice was all around him now, seeping into his thoughts. It wasn't spoken aloud, it was inside him. With a desperate burst of strength, Thomas pushed himself backward, scrambling out of the hole. The journal fell to the ground beside him, its pages flapping violently as if caught in a storm. The writing continued to scrawl itself, though he could barely see it in the dim, flickering light. 10:55 p.m. The shadows are no longer content to watch. They move in, stretching toward him, eager to drag him where the others have gone before. Thomas's heart thundered in his chest as he noticed the shadows around him starting to merge, their dark forms elongating and writhing like ink spilled into water. One by one, they slithered closer, reaching for him with jagged, skeletal fingers. No, he shouted, stumbling to his feet. He grabbed the lantern, holding it aloft like a shield. The light flickered weakly, but it was enough to force the shadows back momentarily. Their hissing whispers grew more frantic, like a chorus of angry snakes. He turned to run, but the journal was suddenly in his hands again. He hadn't picked it up, he was sure of it, but there it was, clutched tightly in his grasp. The weight of it pulled him down, and the scrawled ink burned in his mind. It will not let him go. Not until the truth is known. Not until the deal is struck. Thomas hurled the journal toward the grave, but it didn't land. Instead, it hovered midair, its pages flipping faster and faster as though taunting him. The lantern's light dimmed further, and the ground beneath his feet began to shift unnaturally. He glanced down and saw thin tendrils of shadow snaking up his legs, pinning him in place. A deep, guttural laugh erupted from the figure now standing just beyond the light. Its form was clearer now, its limbs impossibly long and twisted, its face still an abyss of swirling darkness. It extended one arm, pointing toward the journal, and then to Thomas. Read, it hissed, the words slicing through the air like a blade. Thomas shook his head, panic overtaking him. I don't want to. Let me go. Please. The figure stepped closer, and as it did, the lantern's light extinguished completely. Thomas was plunged into darkness, the only illumination now coming from the journal itself. Its pages glowed faintly, the ink writhing and reforming into new text. 11 p.m. Thomas's hesitation seals his fate. But there is still time to learn the truth, though the cost will be everything he has left. Fine, he shouted, tears streaming down his face. I'll read it. As soon as the words left his mouth, the shadows retreated slightly, their grip loosening around his legs. The figure froze, its head tilting as if pleased. Thomas picked up the journal, his hands trembling as he flipped to the next page. The writing was no longer describing his actions. Instead, it told a story of a deal struck centuries ago. A gravedigger much like himself had made a pact with the entity that ruled this cemetery, offering his soul in exchange for eternal knowledge. But the deal came with a curse. Each grave dug was another thread tying him to the cemetery, binding him to the will of the lurking entity. Thomas's breathing quickened as he read the final lines. And so, the digger's soul is passed down, bound to the next who dares to uncover the journal. Their fate is sealed, as yours is now. He looked up, the realization crashing over him like a tidal wave. No, this isn't real. This can't be real. The figure stepped closer, now towering over him. Its voice resonated deep within his chest. You chose to stay, Thomas. You chose to read. And now, you are mine. The ground beneath him opened wide, and this time, no amount of struggling could save him. As he was dragged into the abyss, the journal closed itself with a final snap, the unmarked coffin sealing shut once more. The descent was nothing like Thomas expected. Instead of the cold, suffocating grip of soil, he plunged into a void endless and black, a realm where gravity twisted and light had no meaning. He couldn't scream. The air itself seemed to press against his lungs, robbing him of breath. The journal clung to his chest, burning like a brand against his skin, its weight growing heavier with every passing second. And then, the falling stopped. He landed on something soft, yet firm, like damp earth beneath a shroud of decayed fabric. The air was thick and rancid, carrying the acrid scent of charred wood and rotting flesh. The void around him gave way to faint shapes, twisted trees with gnarled branches, headstones that floated unnaturally in midair, and a sky that swirled with red and black, as though bleeding. Thomas tried to stand, but his legs wobbled like jelly. He glanced down and saw faint tendrils of shadow curling around his ankles, holding him in place. The journal hovered inches from his face, its pages flipping furiously on their own. The glowing ink formed new words, spilling across the pages like blood. Welcome to the Keeper's domain. Time means nothing here. And yet, you are already running out of it. Before Thomas could react, the shadows around him moved. They coalesced into figures, ghostly forms of the dead, their faces gaunt and eyes hollow. Their whispers returned, louder now, a cacophony of pleading voices overlapping in his mind. Help us. Save us. You must break the cycle. Thomas staggered back, his chest heaving. What cycle? What do you want from me? The journal answered, its ink twisting into sharp, jagged letters. The Keeper binds all who disturb its domain. Your choice is simple, replace the Keeper, or join its collection. Thomas's knees buckled as the realization hit him. He glanced around at the wailing figures, noticing something horrifying. Many of them wore clothes from different eras: an old blacksmith's apron, a World War II uniform, a Victorian gown. All grave diggers like him. All trapped here. No, he whispered, shaking his head. This isn't real. This isn't happening. But the Keeper appeared before him, rising from the shadows like smoke taking shape. Its form was more defined now, taller than a man, with clawed hands and a crown of jagged bones encircling its swirling void of a face. It extended one skeletal hand toward him, and the whispers quieted instantly. Choose, it rasped, its voice reverberating through the very ground beneath Thomas. Take my place, or fall forever into oblivion. Thomas's mind raced. What did it mean to replace the Keeper? Was it death? Was it worse? His eyes darted to the journal, which seemed to pulse like a living thing, as if eager for his answer. The faces of the trapped souls turned toward him, their eyes burning with desperation. "Don't do it," one cried, her voice cutting through the silence like a knife. "Don't let it win. It lies." Another figure, a man in a tattered suit, stepped forward. "If you refuse, you'll join us. Eternity here, bound and tormented. You can't escape." The keeper tilted its head, as though amused by the struggle. Its hand remained outstretched, waiting. Thomas clenched his fists, tears streaming down his face. "What happens if I take your place?" The keeper's voice was calm, cold. "You become eternal. The journal is yours. The cycle continues, and you are free." The figures screamed in unison, their cries reverberating through the air. "Don't trust it." Thomas's heart pounded as he weighed his options. If he refused, he would be trapped here, another lost soul wailing in the dark. But if he accepted, would he truly be free? Or would he become something far worse? The journal hovered closer, its pages open to a new entry. 11:30 p.m. Thomas makes his decision. The cemetery waits to welcome its new keeper. The keeper stepped closer, its clawed hand now inches from Thomas's chest. Time seemed to slow as his choices solidified in his mind. His voice broke as he whispered, "I'll dash. I'll take your place," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling as the words slipped from his lips. He wasn't sure if it was courage or desperation that drove his decision. Maybe both. Maybe neither. All he knew was the alternative, eternal torment among the wailing dead, was too horrifying to contemplate. The keeper's hand froze in midair, its jagged claws curling as though forming a smile. Its abyssal face tilted, and a guttural, grating sound escaped at a noise that might have been laughter. So be it. Before Thomas could react, the journal flared to life, its pages alight with an otherworldly glow. The ink bled across the parchment, dripping like black tar as it spread over his hands and up his arms. He screamed, trying to shake it off, but the liquid clung to him, burning as it seeped into his skin. The ground beneath him trembled. The trapped souls cried out in unison, their voices rising in a mournful wail. "No! Don't do this! You'll regret it!" Thomas fell to his knees as the black tar consumed him. The journal hovered above, its pages flipping wildly, creating a deafening sound like the beating of wings. The keeper loomed over him, silent and still, as if savoring the moment. And then, the world around Thomas shattered. Thomas opened his eyes to find himself standing in the center of the cemetery. The air was still, the headstones glistening with dew under a pale moon. The grave he dug earlier was filled, the coffin and journal gone. His shovel leaned casually against a nearby lantern, which flickered weakly in the breeze. For a moment, Thomas thought it had all been a nightmare. But when he moved, his body felt different. He glanced down at his hands and gasped. His skin was pale, almost translucent, veins of inky black running beneath the surface. He reached up, brushing his face, and found it cold to the touch. A voice echoed in his mind, low and sinister, "The journal is yours now, keeper." Thomas turned sharply, looking for the source, but there was no one there. Only the graveyard's shadows seemed to watch him. And then, he felt the weight of the journal in his hands. It was closed now, its cover gleaming with a faint, malevolent light. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time was hard to grasp in his new reality. Thomas roamed the cemetery, his footsteps silent, his presence barely tangible. The headstones whispered as he passed, their inscriptions shifting and reforming. He understood them now, their stories of lives lost, bargains made, and futures stolen. The journal pulsed in his hands, opening of its own accord to a new entry. 12 a.m. The new keeper takes his first watch. The cycle begins anew. He senses them coming, the curious, the greedy, the unsuspecting. He waits for the first to disturb the ground. Thomas stumbled back, his heart pounding, or at least, it would have, if it still beat. He looked down at the pages, trying to will them to stop, to change. But the journal responded only with more words. You are bound now, Thomas. And you will find, it is never that simple. A sound broke the silence. The faint crunch of footsteps on gravel. Thomas turned, his gaze drawn toward the cemetery gates. A figure stood there, holding a flashlight and a bouquet of flowers. They hesitated, looking around nervously, then stepped through the archway. The journal grew heavier in his hands, its pages glowing faintly. The ink began to scrawl itself again, the words forming with agonizing precision. The first visitor arrives, unknowingly stepping into the keeper's domain. What happens next is up to him. Thomas felt the shadows shift around him, eager, expectant. His hands clenched the journal as the realization struck him with chilling clarity. He wasn't just the keeper. He was its arbiter. And the cemetery was hungry. Thomas stood frozen at the edge of the shadows, the journal pulsing in his hands like a heartbeat, his heartbeat now. The visitors stepped cautiously through the cemetery gates, their flashlight cutting weak paths through the gloom. It was a young woman, clutching a bouquet of wilted daisies. Her nervous glances betrayed her unease. Thomas could feel her. Every tremor in her step, every shallow breath. The journal's power coursed through him, pulling him closer to her like a moth to a flame. The words began to write themselves again, the ink gliding across the pages as if with malicious intent. 12:05 a.m. The visitor steps deeper into the keeper's domain, her mind heavy with grief. She does not see the danger, nor sense the shadows that watch her every move. Thomas wanted to scream at her, to tell her to run, to leave this cursed place and never return. But he couldn't. The shadows tightened around him, binding him to his new role. He could only watch as the woman knelt by a gravestone, placing the flowers gently at its base. "Hi, Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I miss you." Thomas's chest tightened as memories of his own father flooded his mind. The ache of loss. The desperate desire to speak one more time. He could feel her pain, her vulnerability. The journal's glow intensified, pulling his attention back to its pages. She mourns, unaware that she has drawn the keeper's gaze. He must decide, spare her, or claim her. "No," Thomas muttered, shaking his head. "I'm not doing this." The journal didn't care. The words shifted, sharpening. "You have no choice, keeper. The cemetery demands a soul. If not hers, then yours." The ground trembled beneath the woman, subtle but unmistakable. She paused, her hand hovering over the gravestone. "What was that?" she whispered, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Thomas stepped forward, instinct overriding fear. "Leave," he croaked, his voice raspy and strained. It was the first word he'd spoken in this cursed realm. The woman froze, her flashlight beam darting wildly through the darkness. "Hello? Who's there?" The shadows around Thomas moved, coiling like living tendrils. They wanted her. Needed her. He could feel their hunger, their pull on him growing stronger. The journal's words burned into his mind. "Speak again, and the shadows will claim you both." Thomas gritted his teeth, his hands trembling. The woman stood, her grip tightening on the flashlight. "This isn't funny," she called, her voice shaking. "Whoever's out there, just leave me alone." The shadows surged forward, creeping toward her feet. She didn't notice, her focus darting between the gravestones and the darkened path behind her. Thomas felt the pull of the journal urging him to act, to make his choice. Time seemed to warp, stretching and contracting as the woman edged closer to the gate. The journal's ink formed a final ultimatum. "Choose now, keeper. Intervene and take her place, or let her be claimed." Thomas's hands shook violently. He couldn't let her die not like this, not because of him. But the journal's words were clear. If he spared her, the cemetery would devour him instead. The woman hesitated at the gate, glancing back at her father's grave one last time. "Goodbye, Dad," she whispered. Then she turned to leave. The shadows writhed in frustration, lashing out toward her retreating figure. Thomas acted without thinking. He stepped forward, raising the journal high, its pages flaring with light. "No," he shouted, his voice carrying a power he didn't understand. The shadows recoiled, their hiss like steam escaping a kettle. The woman froze, her flashlight flickering. But she didn't turn back. She ran, the gate slamming shut behind her. Thomas collapsed to his knees, the journal falling from his hands. The shadows swirled around him angrily, their whispers piercing his thoughts. "You will pay for this, keeper. You cannot escape." The journal opened once more, the ink forming jagged words. 12:10 a.m. The keeper has broken the rules. The cemetery will have its due. The ground beneath him split open, and from the depths, something began to rise. The earth beneath Thomas shuddered violently as the shadows coalesced around the gaping fissure. From the depths came a low, guttural sound, a growl that reverberated through his chest. He scrambled backward, clutching the journal as though it could somehow shield him from whatever was coming. The fissure yawned wider, spilling an unnatural crimson light that cast the cemetery in a hellish glow. Then it emerged, a towering monstrosity of twisting shadows and bone. Its form was a chaotic mass, constantly shifting, with too many limbs and hollow, glowing eyes that seemed to bore straight into Thomas's soul. The journal began to write furiously, the words glowing like embers. 12:15 a.m. The keeper's defiance has summoned the harbinger, the cemetery's enforcer. It will not leave until it has claimed a soul. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. He had no idea how to fight something like this, no idea how to stop it. The harbinger loomed closer, its elongated limbs dragging across the ground, leaving deep gouges in the soil. Its voice was a chorus of tortured screams. "You broke the pact, keeper. You denied the cemetery its due. Now, you will pay the price." Thomas staggered to his feet, holding the journal out in front of him like a talisman. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice was thin and shaky. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't want any of this." The harbinger didn't stop. Its many eyes glowed brighter as it raised one massive, clawed arm, aiming to strike. The shadows around it surged forward like living tendrils, curling hungrily toward Thomas. Desperation clawed at him. He flipped the journal open, hoping for some kind of answer. The pages writhed with new text, the words forming so quickly he could barely keep up. The keeper's only salvation lies within the journal. He must bind the harbinger, as the keeper before him did. But the ritual comes with a price. "What ritual?" Thomas shouted, his voice cracking. "Tell me what to do." The journal seemed to respond to his plea, its pages glowing with renewed intensity. An incantation appeared, written in an unfamiliar, angular script that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. Beneath it, a warning. "The ritual will chain the harbinger, but it will also seal your fate. You will be bound to the cemetery for eternity, unable to leave, unable to die. Are you willing to pay this price, keeper?" Thomas's mind raced. The harbinger was nearly upon him, its massive form blotting out the crimson light. He had seconds to decide. If he didn't act, it would destroy him and likely claim the woman who had just escaped. But if he performed the ritual, he would never be free. He would become a prisoner of this cursed cemetery forever. The harbinger roared, its clawed arm descending in a deadly arc. Thomas made his choice. He screamed the incantation aloud, the unfamiliar words tearing at his throat like shards of glass. The journal flared blindingly bright, its pages igniting in a burst of flame that didn't burn. The cemetery trembled as the shadows recoiled, twisting and writhing as though in agony. The harbinger froze mid-strike, its many eyes wide with fury and pain. The tendrils of light from the journal lashed out, wrapping around its limbs like chains. The monster thrashed violently, its screams shaking the ground, but the light held firm. "You will regret this, keeper," the harbinger hissed, its voice a venomous promise. "You cannot escape what you've become." With a final, ear-splitting roar, the harbinger was dragged back into the fissure. The ground sealed behind it, leaving only silence. Thomas collapsed, the journal falling from his hands. He stared at it, his chest heaving, his mind numb. He was alive. But at what cost? The journal opened one last time, its ink forming a single sentence. 12:20 a.m. The keeper has fulfilled his role. The cemetery is satisfied, for now. The lantern flickered back to life, casting its pale glow over the graves. The shadows retreated, but Thomas knew they were still watching. He could feel them. He could feel everything: the restless dead, the shifting earth, the oppressive presence of the cemetery itself. It was a part of him now. He picked up the journal, its once heavy weight now oddly comforting. The words shifted again. The cycle continues. The cemetery will call for you, keeper. And you will answer. Thomas stood, the crimson light from the fissure lingering in his vision. He looked out over the graves, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what he had become. The cemetery was quiet. For now. The stillness of the cemetery was deceptive, Thomas realized. Though the air felt calm, he could sense the undercurrent of unrest, the buried souls whispering from their graves, the shadows lingering just out of sight, always watching. The journal pulsed faintly in his hands, its presence no longer as alien. It felt natural now, like an extension of himself. The lantern's flickering glow cast long, eerie shadows, but Thomas knew better than to trust the light. The cemetery was alive, and he was its beating heart. As the realization settled over him, the journal opened again, its pages blank at first, then scrawling with new text. The keeper must learn the rules, for without them, the cemetery will consume him. Rules. Thomas's throat tightened as he read the next lines. 1. The cemetery must be fed. A soul for each rising moon. 2. The keeper must ensure the living respect the dead. Trespassers will be punished. 3. The keeper cannot leave the cemetery grounds. To do so is death. 4. The journal must not fall into the wrong hands. Protect it at all costs. 5. The keeper will answer when the cemetery calls. Always. Thomas's hands shook as he read the final line. Failure to uphold these rules will summon the harbinger once more. There are no second chances. The lantern flared, casting strange patterns across the gravestones. Thomas stared at the journal, his mind racing. How was he supposed to do this? He was just a grave digger, a man who spent his days digging holes and moving dirt. He didn't ask for this responsibility, this curse. But now, he was bound to it, and the cemetery would not let him go. His thoughts were interrupted by movement in the distance. The cemetery gates creaked open, and 2 figures slipped inside. Teenagers, judging by their silhouettes. They carried flashlights, their voices hushed but filled with nervous excitement. I told you this place was haunted, one of them said, his tone laced with bravado. You scared? Shut up, Ryan, the other whispered, her voice shaky. Let's just take a couple of pictures and get out of here. Thomas's chest tightened. The rules burned in his mind, trespassers will be punished. The journal began to write again, faster this time, the ink forming sharp, jagged letters. 12:30 a.m. The intruders disturbed the sacred ground. The keeper must decide their fate. No, Thomas muttered, shaking his head. They're just kids. They don't know what they're doing. The journal's text shifted, the ink glowing ominously. Ignorance does not absolve them. The cemetery hungers. The shadows began to stir, creeping toward the teenagers like a tide. They didn't notice at first, too focused on snapping pictures of the graves. But when the air grew colder and the light from their flashlights began to waver, they stopped. Ryan, the girl whispered, clutching his arm. Did you feel that? The boy's bravado faltered as he glanced around. Yeah, let's go. Thomas stepped forward, the journal in his hands glowing like an ember. Leave, he called, his voice carrying an unnatural echo. The teenagers froze, their flashlights darting wildly. "Who's there?" Ryan shouted, his voice cracking. "Show yourself. Leave now." Thomas bellowed, the journal's light flaring. The shadows recoiled slightly, but they didn't retreat entirely. They circled the teenagers, waiting for command. The girl grabbed Ryan's arm, pulling him toward the gate. "Let's go, Ryan. I don't care who it is." As they stumbled toward the exit, the journal's pages flipped furiously. New words formed, sharp and damning. "They have trespassed. The cemetery will not forgive." The shadows surged, blocking the gate. The teenagers screamed, their flashlights flickering out. Thomas felt the weight of the cemetery pressing down on him, demanding action. "Enough," he roared, holding the journal high. The shadows froze, their whispers silenced. The teenagers collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath as the gate creaked open. "Go," Thomas said, his voice softer now. "Don't come back." They didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled out of the cemetery, disappearing into the night. Thomas sank to his knees, his energy drained. The journal's pages turned slowly, its text forming a final warning. "The keeper has shown mercy. The cemetery will not forget. The next time, it will demand payment in blood." The lantern dimmed, and the shadows retreated once more. Thomas sat there in the dark, the weight of his role pressing down on him like a shroud. He had survived the night, but the cemetery's hunger remained. And it would not wait long to be fed. Thomas sat slumped against a crumbling headstone, the journal heavy in his lap. The cemetery was quiet again, but the silence was oppressive. It wasn't peace, it was anticipation. The air felt charged, as though the cemetery itself were holding its breath, waiting for him to act. The journal stirred to life, flipping to a blank page. Fresh ink bled into the parchment, forming a sinister new message. 12:45 a.m. The keeper delays the inevitable. The cemetery hungers, and its patience wears thin. "No," Thomas whispered, shaking his head. "I won't do it. There has to be another way." The ink twisted violently, the letters growing jagged and sharp. "There is no other way. A soul must be taken. If you will not act, the cemetery will choose." Thomas felt the ground tremble beneath him, faint but undeniable. The lantern flickered ominously, its light casting strange, writhing shapes across the graves. The shadows stirred, restless and hungry. He clutched the journal tighter, his breath quickening. "Please," he said aloud, his voice trembling. "There has to be another way. I can't kill anyone. I won't." The journal's pages flared with light, its ink shifting again. The keeper's mercy weakens the balance. The cemetery grows stronger. If no soul is given, the harbinger will return to claim many. Thomas's stomach churned. He felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of his role. He stared out over the cemetery, his eyes scanning the rows of graves, the eerie glow of moonlight casting long shadows over the tombstones. That's when he saw her. A woman in a flowing white dress stood near a mausoleum at the edge of the cemetery. She moved gracefully, her hands gliding over the cool stone as if she were reading the names etched into the weathered surface. Her presence was ethereal, almost ghostly. Thomas blinked. He hadn't seen her enter. How long had she been there? The journal's pages flipped violently, ink spilling across the parchment like blood. 12:50 a.m. The living dare to linger where they do not belong. The cemetery has chosen its offering. "No," Thomas hissed, rising to his feet. "Not her." The journal's glow dimmed, the ink fading momentarily. But the ground beneath the woman shifted, the soil loosening. The shadows slithered toward her, their movements deliberate and predatory. Thomas bolted toward her, his legs moving faster than he thought possible. "Get out of here," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You have to leave now." The woman turned, her face serene yet curious. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice calm, almost melodic. She didn't seem afraid. "There's no time to explain," Thomas yelled, grabbing her arm. "You have to go. Now." She looked down at his hand, then back at him. "You're the keeper, aren't you?" Thomas froze, his grip slackening. "How do you know that?" Her eyes were dark and piercing, her expression unreadable. "I've heard the stories. I've seen what happens to those who wander here after midnight. But I had to see for myself. I had to know if it was true." Her words sent a chill down his spine. She knew. She had come here deliberately, knowing the danger. "You don't understand," he said, his voice urgent. "The cemetery, it's alive. It wants you. If you don't leave, it'll dash." The ground beneath them shook violently, cutting him off. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around her ankles like serpents. She gasped, her calm facade cracking as the tendrils pulled her toward the mausoleum. "No!" Thomas screamed, grabbing her arms and pulling her back. The shadows fought him, their strength almost overwhelming. He could hear the journal's pages flipping wildly behind him, its ink screaming in his mind. 12:55 a.m. The keeper defies the cemetery's will. The balance crumbles. Thomas gritted his teeth, his muscles straining as he pulled against the shadows. "I won't let it take you." The woman's eyes met his, her expression softening. "You can't fight it," she whispered. "It's stronger than you." "Then help me," he shouted. "There has to be a way to stop this." Her gaze lingered on him for a moment before she nodded. "There is. But it will cost you everything." The shadows tightened their grip, pulling harder. The journal's glow intensified, its pages turning faster than ever. Thomas felt the weight of his decision bearing down on him. "What do I have to do?" he asked, his voice raw. The woman leaned closer, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "The cemetery needs a keeper, but it doesn't have to be you." Thomas's blood ran cold as her meaning became clear. She was offering herself. "No," he said, shaking his head. "I can't let you dash." "You don't have a choice," she said firmly. "If I stay, the cemetery will spare you. But if you fight it, we both die." The ground beneath them split open, a deep, crimson light spilling forth. The shadows surged, their whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. Thomas stared at her, his heart pounding, as the journal's final warning burned into his mind. The cemetery has chosen. The keeper must decide. Thomas stared into the woman's eyes, her calm resolve a sharp contrast to the chaos erupting around them. The shadows writhed, their whispers swelling into a maddening cacophony. The ground beneath them split wider, the crimson light illuminating the woman's face as if framing her sacrifice. "I can't let you do this," Thomas said, his voice cracking. His hands clung to her arms, even as the shadows coiled tighter around her ankles. "You don't know what it's like. The cemetery, it won't just take you, it will keep you." The woman's expression softened, but her tone was resolute. "You think I don't know that? I came here for this. I've seen what the cemetery does. Someone has to stop it from taking more." Her words hit him like a blow. She knew the cost, yet here she was, offering herself willingly. The journal flared to life in his hands, its ink scrawling furiously across the pages. 12:58 a.m. The cemetery demands a soul. The keeper falters, torn between mercy and duty. Time is running out. The ground trembled violently, the shadows growing more aggressive. Thomas could feel their hunger, their pull, their insatiable need for life. If he didn't act, they would claim her and likely him as well. "There has to be another way," he yelled, his voice desperate. "Tell me what to do." The woman shook her head. "The cemetery doesn't bargain, Thomas. It only takes." The journal's pages turned again, the words sharper and more urgent. 12:59 a.m. The keeper must decide. A soul or the cemetery's wrath. The harbinger waits. Thomas felt tears streaming down his face as he looked at her. He didn't even know her name, yet here she was, ready to give everything for a stranger. The shadows tightened, and the crimson light grew blinding. He knew the truth, even if he didn't want to admit it. If he didn't let her go, they would both be consumed. The woman placed a hand on his cheek, her touch cold but comforting. "Let me do this," she said softly. "You're not ready to leave this world." "But I am." Thomas's grip loosened, his hands trembling. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. She smiled faintly. "Don't be." With a final, wrenching pull, the shadows tore her from his grasp. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. Her body dissolved into the writhing darkness, consumed by the hungry tendrils. The crimson light flared once more, then vanished, leaving only silence. The ground sealed itself, the fissure closing as if it had never been. The shadows retreated, slithering back into the depths of the cemetery. The lantern flared to life again, its steady glow casting a hollow light over the gravestones. Thomas collapsed to his knees, the journal slipping from his grasp. He stared at the empty space where the woman had stood, the weight of his choice crushing him. The journal opened beside him, its pages glowing faintly. New text began to form, slow and deliberate. 1 a.m. The keeper has chosen. The cemetery is satisfied, for now. Thomas wiped his face, his hands streaked with dirt and tears. He picked up the journal, its weight familiar now. The words continued to write themselves, their tone cold and unfeeling. But the cemetery's hunger will return. It always does. The keeper must be ready when the cycle begins anew. He staggered to his feet, clutching the journal tightly. The cemetery was quiet again, but he knew better than to trust the stillness. The shadows would rise again. The cemetery would demand another soul. And next time, he might not have anyone else to save him. Thomas walked toward the graveyard center, his steps heavy, his heart hollow. The journal glowed faintly in his hands, a constant reminder of the choice he had made and the ones yet to come. As he reached the lantern, he looked up at the night sky, now eerily serene. The cemetery had claimed its offering. For now, he was safe. But deep down, he knew he would never truly be free.